What's going on, Lions fans? Welcome to the Pride Detroit YouTube channel. I'm Meko, and in today's video, we are going to be recapping rounds 2 through 7 of the NFL draft and going through all of the draft picks that the Detroit Lions made. And I'm going to be giving you guys my thoughts on each pick and my overall opinion of this draft class now that the draft is officially over. Now, before we get started, if you are new to this YouTube channel, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, hitting a like on this video would help us out immensely. All of those things really help us out in the YouTube algorithm, help us get in front of more people and more Lions fans so that, our content kind of just gets spread out a little bit more efficiently. But with that said, let's go ahead and get started in this video and kind of breaking down the rest of this draft class. Now, if you're wondering why I'm not going to be talking about Terrion Arnold, that's because Morgan and I already did a separate video where we recapped, Terrion Arnold, what we liked about him, how we think he fits on this team, and what type of impact he could have for the Lions as a first-round draft pick and as, the first rookie on this Lions roster. So if you want to check that video out after this video, go ahead and check that out. You can hear all the great things that we had to say about Terrion Arnold. But I didn't get a chance to talk about Ennis Rakestraw Jr., who was the Lions' second overall pick at pick 61 yesterday during the second round of the NFL draft. And if you saw, kind of my instant reaction video that was up on Instagram and TikTok, this was a pick that surprised me quite a bit, and for a number of reasons. The first reason is, even though I did think the Lions would potentially double dip at corner, and I thought it would be very smart for them to double dip at corner, I never really considered it in the second round. I more so was thinking that if the Lions were to go and address and draft another corner, they would probably wait to rounds, 4, 5, or 6, or not 4 because they didn't have a fourth round pick, but rounds 5 or 6 and find another, depth piece that could be potentially, a contributor in the future. But they decided to go ahead and go with Ennis Rakestraw Jr. in the second round. And I honestly had completely forgot that he was still available. He was one of the corners that I did take a look at during the draft process. And while I thought he had some very good traits, he definitely was a step behind the likes of, Terrion Arnold, Quinion Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, and even Kool-Aid McKinstry. He was kind of in that third tier of corners for me, but he did have a number of physical traits that really, made him stand out. And I could at least understand why some people thought, he could be an end of the first round type of guy or a day 2 guy, which he ended up being. And I also think when you start to look at Rakestraw Jr., he does have a lot of the traits that make him appealing to the Lions, and it kind of does make this seem like a perfect marriage of player and skill set and the type of defense that Aaron Glenn is expecting from his secondary. Ennis Rakestraw Jr. is a pretty big corner. He's about 6 feet tall, 188 pounds. He's very, very physical. He loves to get involved in the run game. He will absolutely hit you. If you saw his presser, he even talked about sometimes he views himself as a linebacker out there. He is not afraid to impose his will on receivers or running backs. He's not afraid to kind of mix it up when it comes down to the physicality of things. And that is something that you absolutely want if you're the Detroit Lions, and if you're looking at a secondary that saw a couple of receivers and running backs just kind of run through them or run through some of these arm tackles. With Terrion Arnold and Ennis Rakestraw Jr., you get 2 young corners that are capable of finishing tackles and limiting the number or the amount of yak opposing teams can rack up against you. He's also someone that I think is very, very good in zone coverage. He does have the capability of playing man, but when you look at his tape, you look at some of his PFF grades, he definitely grades out as a much better zone coverage corner. And because of that, I think that is partially why, like, if you start looking at some of his stats, he does have a fairly high completion percentage against him, about 64%. And I kind of attribute a little bit of that to the fact that he plays zone coverage. If you guys remember when Morgan and I broke down the Carlton Davis tape and even some of the Amik Robertson tape, when those guys are in zone coverage, you oftentimes are giving up a lot of cushion. You're also typically allowing guys to catch routes underneath. And in that case, you are now having to rally and tackle, which fortunately for Ennis Rakestraw Jr. plays perfectly into his skill set. And so that is going to be something that's going to be very interesting to see how the Lions kind of tailor his game at the next level. Are they going to put him in more zone coverage opportunities, or are they going to actually challenge him to play man a little bit more and see how he develops? Because like I said, I think he does have the physical traits. I know he didn't run the fastest 40 or very disappointing 40 at the combine and at his pro day, but he was coming off of a core/groin injury that he was still somewhat recovering from. So a lot of teams are at least taking that into account, or at least the Lions are for sure taking that into account by drafting him. And I think when you look at the tape, he doesn't look like a slow guy. Now, granted, the Lions have been burned by that before. Tease Tabor, someone who, wasn't quite considered slow on tape and obviously struggled at the NFL level. But I do think the fact that he did have this injury could have, in fact, hampered him quite a bit when you start to look at how he performed at the combine and the pro day. Even at a 4.51, you also have to consider Terrion Arnold didn't run a blazing 40 either. I think he was about at a 4.5 as well. So depending on how you play them in coverage, depending on how often you put them in press, or depending on how they just, how they run on the field versus in a 40-yard dash could be drastically different. And I think the Lions would not have drafted Rakestraw Jr. if they didn't believe he didn't have the physical tools to, keep up with the NFL receivers that he's going to be matched up against. Now, one thing that I think is going to be different with Rakestraw Jr. in comparison to Terrion Arnold is Morgan and I both kind of agreed on this, that Terrion Arnold has a very good chance of starting. And it wouldn't surprise either one of us if the Lions gave him starting reps. Now, I think Amik Robertson will have something to say about that and will challenge for that. But if the Lions do decide to start Terrion Arnold as CB2, I think he, by the time the season starts, would be firmly in that CB2 spot, and that the Lions would feel comfortable starting him and Carlton Davis as your top two corners. Ennis Rakestraw Jr., I think, is going to take some time. I think he's a great depth piece, and considering the fact that Carlton Davis has kind of struggled with injuries throughout his career, you could still have a depth piece that could be ready to be, called up at any moment to start in place of Carlton Davis Jr. Or Carlton Davis III, sorry, opposite Terrion Arnold. I think the thing, though, that is most beneficial is that you get the same thing that you get with Terrion Arnold, which is you get a young guy in a veteran room that is going to be able to soak up all of this knowledge and all of this experience from veteran players that can help him work on his game. If he is lacking in man coverage, you have two great man corners in Carlton Davis III and Robertson that can actually work with him, after practice in the meeting rooms to help him get better at those, qualities. So like I said, was a bit of a shock because I just didn't think the Lions would, address this pick or this position again so early. But it is actually a very good pick. I know some people are probably hoping that they would go edge, but when you look at the quality of talent, I don't know if there was an edge player off the top of my head, that was of equal value to what Ennis Rakestraw Jr. could be for the Lions, this upcoming season. And again, like I said, I think he could possibly challenge, maybe go into the season as CB3, who could potentially even actually back up Brian Branch, because, Ennis Rakestraw Jr. did have roughly 200 snaps at the slot position as well. So even if he's not backing up, the immediate backup behind Carlton Davis or Terrion Arnold, he could be the next, man up behind Brian Branch, because he does have that versatility to play in the slot. I think by year 2, you could definitely see an opportunity for him to be, CB2 to Terrion Arnold CB1, because I think that's the type of progression these two corners could have under Dan Campbell and under Aaron Glenn on this defense. So that's going to do it for Ennis Rakestraw Jr., the Detroit Lions second round pick. As we all know, because the Lions traded up in the first round to get Terrion Arnold, they did not have that 73rd pick in the third round. So the Lions didn't get back on the clock until the fourth round, where they traded some additional assets. I think they traded a future third round pick to get into the fourth round to take their next pick, which is Giovanni Manu, offensive tackle out of British Columbia, a Canadian player, but an absolute freak. I mean, you're talking about a dude that's around 6'7", 6'8", standing at 350 pounds. This dude looks like a physical specimen. Like, if this was WWE, like, they would be drooling over a guy like this. This is somebody that you would look at and be like, oh, he can be a future champion in the WWE, because he is just built very, very well. It's probably the most impressive 6'8", 350-pound dude you will ever see in your life. When he had his pro day, a couple of teams, a good amount of teams actually went out to go see him. Apparently the Lions were one of those. He ran about a 5-second 40. He had a really impressive vertical jump. Like, again, outside of just stature, is a very athletic player, and it definitely shows on the field. Where, again, playing in Canada, playing for British Columbia, against those players, he basically looked like a man amongst boys. And that, I think, allowed him to have a lot of success. And I can see why those types of traits would be appealing to an NFL team like the Detroit Lions, who I went into this draft process saying that I thought tackle was actually a bigger need than interior offensive lineman. And while so many people were saying like, hey, the Lions need to draft a replacement center or a backup, guard, I was definitely looking at the idea of like, hey, they definitely need someone on the outside to back up the likes of Taylor Decker and Penei Sewell. Now, I'm not saying Manu is immediately ready to do that right now, because coming from the Canadian game, I do think there's going to be a steep learning curve. While he was able to be out there in British Columbia and just impose his will and his size and his athleticism on a lot of those players there, you get to the NFL, and this is no different if you play in Canada or if you play in the US. There is a drastic change in the athletic profile of the players that you're playing against. Everybody's large, everybody's quick. And again, while he still maybe he's taller than a lot of people, and he could even be faster than some of the defensive, linemen that he's matched up against, you also have to factor in that these defensive linemen are more technically sound. And that's where I think Manu is going to have to show the most growth and the most improvement is in his technique. Can he get into pass sets well? What is he doing with his hands? If Hank Fraley can iron those details out, if he is quick at picking those things up and implementing them into his game, this could be one of the greatest projects that Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell have ever undertaken. And it would be probably, listen, Hank Fraley is one of the greatest coaches to coach offensive line. If he is able to turn Giovanni Manu into a high quality tackle, even as a reserve tackle, listen, I don't know what it takes for an offensive line coach to get into the Hall of Fame, but I'd be ready to put him in there if he was able to do that with a player like this. Like I said, Manu is absolutely imposing physically and looks the part of someone that, again, if he can iron out the technical things, if he can figure out hand placement, if he can figure out pass sets, if he can, not be a liability in terms of getting beat by more technically sound defensive, ends and linebackers, he's somebody that could provide quality depth for this team. Or at worst, given his size, given his athleticism, the Lions could always choose to kick him inside, and he would be probably an even more imposing offensive guard in the coming years of his career. So it's definitely a projection. It's definitely a project. It's very much in the same light as Broderick Martin was last year. But I do like the ceiling of what this player can be, especially in the hands of one of the greatest offensive line coach, Hank Fraley. I think the Lions could have something very special here if Manu is able to adjust quickly, or not even quickly, but just make consistent improvements in his game at the NFL level. Now, Giovanni Manu was not the only player that the Detroit Lions decided to trade up for in the fourth round. They were able to package some more draft picks together to get back into the fourth round to draft Sione Vaki, the running back / safety out of Utah. And when he was announced, or when this pick was announced, the Lions did dub him as a running back. And this is the type of versatility that Vaki is going to present and bring to the Detroit Lions, is that versatility to, and what I consider to be, a special teams ace. Because listen, they have two great running backs currently on the roster with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. Those two guys are kind of carrying the rushing attack for this Lions offense at the current moment. And they still also have Craig Reynolds, who they like, and they like to implement for a couple touches here, or just to kind of spell both running backs. But with the addition of Vaki, and if they are actually going to be using him primarily as running back, this introduces a whole new level of competition for Craig Reynolds, because the Lions have always said it. Whenever they have two players that they really like that are very good, it ultimately is going to come down to special teams. And I think with them drafting a player like Vaki, they are getting an upgrade in that regard of somebody that they know can absolutely contribute in the special teams, not just as a returner, because he can do that, but he can also be out as a gunner. He can also be out there trying to block punts, and if they so choose to use him in that manner. And with the kickoff rules changing, again, he does become an option of somebody that you can consider for bringing back or returning kicks for your team. Now, I'll be completely honest, I would prefer to see him being utilized more so as a safety and in a reserve role for the safety group, because there's not a lot of depth at that position. But with a player of this stature, you kind of don't do yourself a disservice, or you're not doing yourself a disservice, if you decide to test him out on both sides of the ball and see which side he's most comfortable with, where you're able to get the most usage out of him. And that's why I say, like, he kind of at the very least will be a special teams ace, because at least you know that you can put him out there on special teams. More than likely, obviously, he'll still have to go out there and compete and show it, but at the very least, like, you know, he can do that for your team, is go out there on special teams and contribute. What he's able to do on the offensive end and what he's able to do on the defensive end may potentially just be a bonus for what you're getting in this player. Now, the question will be, is a player like that worth a 4th round pick? And that is something that only Brad Holmes and this coaching staff can decide. I know there may be some fans that may be looking at the board and looking at who was available in the 4th round to say, hey, why not get a player like Vaki in the 6th round or the 7th round to see if he's available? But we know how Brad Holmes works. We know how this regime works. When they see a guy, if they like a guy, they are not going to risk the possibility of losing him just because our mock drafts or somebody else's mock draft says that he's going to be there in the 5th or 6th round. So I'm not going to knock the decision to trade up for him. We will really have to see how he's utilized. And if he's someone that can go onto this roster, go into camp and outcompete Craig Reynolds, the third running back on this roster that has seemed to outlast every other running back challenge that they've been able to throw in front of him, it will go a long way in proving that, you know what, this is a player that's worth keeping. There's also the possibility, listen, the Lions still haven't, re-signed Jason Kabinda. So the fullback role is currently wide open. And it's a possibility that the Lions decide to go into next season without bringing in a fullback. If they decide to do that, instead of just carrying 3 running backs, the Lions could decide to carry 4 running backs and use one of their tight ends to play, that fullback role instead. So Vaki might have an easier path to getting a roster spot, but at the very least, as things currently stand, based on how the Lions have currently constructed their roster, a competition between him and Craig Reynolds should be should at least be the number one thing that we should expect out of him. And if he can beat out Reynolds, there may be a path to him having some big time contribution on this team, even if it is at special teams. Now, by trading up to get Vaki in the 4th round, the Lions had to give up that 5th round pick, which meant that they weren't back on the clock until the 6th round, and they still had to do some trading just to be able to get high enough in the 6th round to take their next pick, Mekhi Wingo, the defensive tackle out of LSU. And when you turn his tape on, Wingo is a very, very fun player to watch. He looks very explosive. He looks very quick. He looks very, effective in the pass rush aspect of playing defensive tackle. The only reason that he probably slides this far, he's undersized. He's about 6 feet tall, maybe 6'1", once you add on cleats. And so, he's not someone that is overly impressive in the run game, but he is effective. He's not a complete liability. But when you're 6 feet, somewhere between 6 feet and 6'1", you don't have the longest arms. You don't have great size or mass in any kind of way. It can be kind of difficult for teams to determine how they're going to utilize you. But the Detroit Lions have some experience with drafting a defensive tackle that's slightly undersized in Alim McNeill, and we've all seen how effective Alim was as a 3rd round pick that the Lions drafted a couple years ago. If they are able to get similar type of production out of Wingo, at the very least, you are, again, looking at a depth piece that can play behind Alim and, again, spell him when he's going to be on the field as much as he probably is. And he also provides some competition for the likes of Levi Onwuzurike or John Kaminsky, players that the Lions like and players that the Lions like to have in their rotation. But if you're looking to, again, raise the floor of your defensive tackle room, if you're looking to inject some competition, Mekhi Wingo can do that for you. With 3 years at the college level, Wingo was able to tally up 11 sacks despite being undersized. And in 2023, he was able to rack up 5 sacks. So this is a guy that knows how to utilize his size, utilize leverage, and be able to, again, get into the backfield. The thing that the Detroit Lions are going to have to work on are, again, understanding pad level, understanding how to, maintain gaps and how to be able to keep him from allowing his size to be a liability. And with the Lions having a new defensive line coach, one of the most highly respected defensive line coaches in the NFL, it does give you some hope that with the likes of, Aleem McNeil, DJ Reader, Josh Pascal, John Kaminsky, that you have some depth there where Wingo is not going to be expected to come in immediately and contribute. He can take a year, much like Broderick Martin did last year, take some time to develop if he's not necessarily ready to compete right away. So that's Mekhi Wingo in a nutshell. With the Lions' last pick, which they also made in the 6th round, they were able to take Christian Mahogany, another interior offensive lineman or another offensive lineman that I think it could potentially be the steal of the draft for the Detroit Lions. Mahogany was somebody that a lot of draft analysts had rated very highly. He was very, very good as a run blocker. Last year, he also didn't give up a sack. He only gave up 1 sack in his college career, which is very, very impressive, and primarily could serve as a replacement or at least, again, a developmental player behind Kevin Zeitler, seeing as he primarily played right guard at the college level. And like I said, Mahogany mostly grades out well as a top tier run blocker, which is something that we know the Detroit Lions love to do with their, dual headed monster with Montgomery and Gibbs in the backfield. You continue to, provide quality depth and youth on that offensive line and allow these guys to, once again, much like the cornerback room, learn from the veterans in the room, learn what it means to be a pro, help them work on some of the technical things that maybe keep them from being as successful as they need to be in one aspect of their game. Maybe with someone like Mahogany, there's some issues with his hands or his feet. You get him with Hank Fraley and someone that is already, considered very impressive at the college game can only get better if he's willing to dedicate himself to the game. Mahogany is also known to have a bit of a mean streak, which, again, you pair that next to Penei Sewell, you are going to get something very, very impressive in the future, or could get something very impressive in the future if he's able to develop, because we already know when it comes down to running the ball and running towards Penei's side, it gets pretty nasty. He's one of the best tackles in football for a reason. And now you're just, again, adding more depth. You obviously drafted Colby Sorsdahl last year. Hopefully his development continues to improve. And if it does, and if he continues to take steps forward, you possibly have your left guard of the future. Now you have Mahogany, you have your right guard of the future, you have Manu, a future tackle. All of this is obviously like you're projecting, you're hoping that these guys develop in a way that's going to lead to them making an impact. But that's something that this coaching staff has been doing since they got here. I know we've all kind of been used to and accustomed to the fact of like the Lions drafting players and there being immediate impact, but this might be the first draft class where we're going to have to be much more patient, where some of these players might take the Derek Barnes, Ifeatu Melifonwu route, where it might take them until year 2 or 3 for them to start actually contributing at a high level. But ultimately, I think Mahogany is a solid pick with a group that you definitely needed to address between the likes of, again, Graham being a little bit older, Zeitler only being on a 1-year deal, Frank Ragnow battling injury. Mahogany, again, can slide into this room, learn from the vets, and we can reevaluate, later in the season if injuries occur. Maybe he's somebody that gets called up, or again, at the very least, we're looking at year 2, possibly year 3 as him being a player that's ready to step in and possibly man the starting right guard position for the Detroit Lions. So, guys, that's all 5 of the draft picks that the Detroit Lions made today. Like I said, if you want to see about Terrion Arnold, Morgan and I did a video on that yesterday. But with all that said, what does that actually mean about this draft class? And when I look at it, this is one of the more different draft classes that I think, like I said a little while ago, it's going to look very, very different than anything else that I think this Lion regime has done, because I think this is one of those draft classes where, at least on paper, without seeing how things look in camp, without seeing what injuries maybe pop up, as of right now, For me personally, I see one player that could be starting for you week 1, and that's Terrion Arnold. The rest of these players, you have added a lot of depth and a lot of competition. And that depth and competition, for me at least, raises the floor immediately for what this team can be. Once we get into camp, once we get into the season, we will find out whether or not the Lions actually raise the ceiling of this team with some of these players. Does an Ennis Rakestraw Jr. actually hit and actually push somebody else in the secondary out of a starting spot? And now you have 2 corners in their rookie year starting for you. Does a guy like Giovanni Manu actually not have as many, deficiencies in his game, or is he able to quickly adapt? And now you have a quality swing tackle that you can use instead of Dan Skipper to go out there and do some really incredible things. The list can kind of go on and on for all of these players. Does Vaki come in here as a special teams ace and really transform and help your special teams unit rise to another level? That is what I like when I look at this draft class. It's a lot of potential. It's a lot of projection. It's a lot of, hey, wait and see. And I get that for some people, that's going to annoy you. When looking at the draft class that Brad Holmes was able to bring in last year, 2 Pro Bowlers, 2 starters on the defensive side of the football that heavily contributed, and one that looks like a future star at his position in Brian Branch, I can absolutely understand why some people might be frustrated with this draft class and with me saying like, hey, this is a lot of depth and this is a lot of projects. But that's essentially where this team is. Going into this draft year, there was no guarantee that you were going to get a bunch of starters. It was very likely that you were going to get exactly what the Lions have: depth, competition, and at the very least, worst case scenario, worst word that I could possibly use is a project, right? Manu might be a project. Wingo might be a project. Mahogany might be a project. But only time will tell. Only them getting into camp and once pads go on. Initially thinking when Brian Branch was drafted last year, there were people who thought like, hey, he might just play behind CJ He played so well that they had to move CJ to safety so that they could get Brian Branch on the field. So we truly do not know at present what this draft class will do simply by looking at their names on paper. But I do think the potential for each of these picks is very good. I don't think any of these picks have a future where they're not contributing in some capacity. Like I said, whether it's as a quality reserve or in the likes of Vaki and possibly even Mingo, probably getting involved on special teams, or even Rakestraw Jr. getting involved on special teams. Now, there are positions that weren't addressed. And if you didn't, catch some of the videos where Morgan and I were talking about this, or even the podcast that I did with Eric over on his podcast, going into this draft cycle, we also knew that there were going to be positions that were not going to be addressed. The Lions didn't draft a wide receiver. So the X position, quote unquote, wide receiver X position still has a bit of a question mark on it. They didn't draft an edge. That still has a question mark on it. The Lions still have free agency. There are still some veteran players out there that they can go kick the tires on that have been waiting this entire time, waiting for the draft to go by to figure out what teams would possibly need them the most. So before we start to just, throw a tantrum and want to boo Brad Holmes because he didn't draft the wide receiver you wanted, or he didn't draft the edge player you wanted, or didn't draft the edge when you wanted him to draft an edge, we do need to take a step back and see, okay, how do they fill out the rest of this roster? Because it's not done. It's not complete. Going into OTAs, going into camp, things may happen where they're going to have to pivot and find veteran players or undrafted, free agents to bring in, and who knows how those players turn out, and who knows what those competitions look like once the season starts. So I'm not going to grade this draft. I think we've kind of learned through the years that grading a draft is just not the best thing to do, because you just never know how these things are going to turn out. But I will say I like this draft. I don't love this draft. And that's just me personally. There are players in this draft. I love Terrion Arnold. I love Ennis Rakestraw Jr. I am very, very intrigued by the prospect of Giovanni Manu. But like I said, it's a lot of projects for me. And we will see how those projects look as we go through OTAs, as we go through camp, and potentially probably not until next year will we finally see, hey, were these quality investments and were these players able to improve throughout a camp, throughout a season, and are they able to actually contribute when the Lions need them most? If they're able to do that, who cares when it happens? Who cares if it's week 1 or week 15 when we finally see one of these players actually make an impact for this roster? At the end of the day, like I said earlier, I think they did raise the floor of this entire roster at the very least. And that is what I expect Brad Holmes to do as a GM. I don't expect him to get all pros and pro bowlers with every single pick. Improve the roster, add depth, add competition. And that's what the Lions did this year. So with that, I'm happy. But that's just me. I want to hear from you guys. How are you guys feeling about this NFL draft now that it's officially over? What's your favorite pick? What do you feel about some of the day 2 and day 3 picks that the Lions made? Who's your favorite pick? Whatever it is that you want to wax poetically about, let me know in the comment section below. Also, if you're looking for any more coverage, if you're looking for any more info on any of the draft picks that were made either today, yesterday, or on the first day of the draft, you can always head over to prideofdetroit.com. The guys have been working tirelessly, I mean tirelessly, to make sure that there is content about each one of these players. So go ahead and check out prideofdetroit.com. Also, stay tuned to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Morgan and I are going to be doing film breakdowns of each of these draft picks. Giovanni Manu might be kind of tough to find, but all the prospects that we can find tape of, we're going to break them down and try to paint a picture of what these players do well and where they probably need to improve most. So you want to be tuned into the Pride of Detroit, YouTube channel as well. So with all that said, I'm Meko. Thank you guys for taking the time to watch, and I will be sure to catch you guys in the next one.